Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. And today we have back on our show for the third time Professor Stephen Eric Bronner, Professor of Political Science at Rutgers University, an author, prolific intellectual, and we are going to be talking for a whole hour about a variety of topics, but in particular we want to kind of focus on Bernie Sanders and his run for president this year, who he's being accused of being too utopian. That's become like a dirty word in this campaign, that they say that he's unrealistic or he's got to get with the program. He's not as realistic as Hillary Clinton. And I think for a lot of people, they might not realize that utopian ideas go back a long time, you know, and they're part of the intellectual community. And Stephen is the author of this book here on critical theory, a very short introduction that's put out by Oxford University Press. And I think just to sort of educate Americans who might not be aware, and not just Americans, anybody who's watching our show, which goes around the world, okay, what is critical theory? This is a great book that will sort of get you up to speed on what that's all about. And I think it's very relevant to this particular election cycle, okay? Let's just read what it says on the back of the book. It says, Critical Theory, a very short introduction. This is the only book of its kind. It is a readable yet expertly crafted tour through the Frankfurt School, along with a forceful account of why the Frankfurt School of Critical Thought still matters a decade into the new millennium. This was published in 2010. I can't recommend it highly enough. And that was said by Jeffrey Nealon, who is a professor of English at Pennsylvania State University, co-editor of Rethinking the Frankfurt School. And on the inside flap, it says, critical theory emerged in the 1920s from the work of the Frankfurt School, the circle of German Jewish academics who sought to diagnose and, if at all possible, cure the ills of society, particularly fascism and capitalism. In this book, Stephen Eric Bronner provides sketches of leading representatives of the critical tradition, such as George Lukács and Ernst Bloch, Theodor Adorno and William Benjamin, Herbert Marcuse and Jürgen Habermas, as well as many of its seminal texts and empirical investigators. The book also sheds light on the cluster of ideas and themes that set critical theory apart from its more traditional philosophical competitors, explaining the concepts such as method and agency, alienation and reification, the culture industry and repressive tolerance, non-identity and utopia. So let's begin with utopia. And Bernie Sanders is being dismissed as being, rainbows and puppy dogs, right? That this is what you hear from the right, and this is what you hear from people in the Hillary Clinton camp. Let's talk about that interconnection between critical theory from one of the leading critical theorists in the world, and what is your analysis of the Bernie Sanders candidacy?
Well, let's maybe the place to begin is with utopia, and I appreciate being here again, and it's really always a pleasure. You know, the difficulty with talking about utopia is that it's actually a very complicated topic. It has a long tradition, and if you think of any great mass movement, there's going to be a utopian element in its ideology. This is true of communism, it's true of fascism, it's true of the original women's movement. You can think of Martin Luther King and the religious element. All of these things have a certain utopian a basis or a utopian element within them. Now, the key thing about utopia is that it's utopian, if I can put it this way. In other words, utopia, to bring it about, is a contradiction in terms. And the reason is very simple, because to bring a utopia about, you need utopian individuals who obviously don't exist. Now, so what's the value of it? I think the values, again, it's a very simple thing. You have to have certain ideals for which you're willing to commit yourself, and which provide, shall we say, guidelines for where you want to go and in what direction you want to go. It could be the ideal, the utopian ideal of social equality. It could be the ideal of economic equality. It could be the ideal of democracy, like Occupy Wall Street used. There are many different elements to this, and it seems to me, when we're talking about it today, if you want to talk about it in a positive way, some kind of utopian element in one's thinking or in one's practice keeps both the theory and the practice from simply becoming identical with the prejudices and the limits of what exists now. I think the proper term for this is a regulative ideal. You have an ideal that sort of leads you in the direction you want to go, and I think utopia provides that function for practice today by Democrats and by reasonable people. Now, with regard to what's interesting about Bernie Sanders and his democratic socialist tradition, of which I like to think of myself as a part, is these proposals that he has put forward. Really, these are not bizarre, transcendent concerns. I mean, that's just silly, and it's propaganda. If you want to talk utopia, you can think of Occupy. Direct democracy, no institutions, a new idea of politics with new language, without power, things like that. That's utopian. You want to think about economics that's utopian. It's literally you split everything up. You're in a world where people don't have to work, which, by the way, is a real utopian ideal. That ideal inspired every labor movement that exists, because what's common to every labor movement that exists is a desire to shorten the working day. And from that, and how do you justify that, or how do you move in the right direction? Leisure and fun. Yeah, and these are utopian demands. I mean, you're not going to reach the point where people don't work at all, but it's a goal you look toward and that inspires your concern with reducing odious labor. So, if we think of the key thing in Bernie Sanders' campaign, it's probably this discussion over health care and single-payer health care. Now, there are a lot of countries that have single-payer health care. I mean, just that simple. And in fact, we are. It's not just Denmark, as some of the critics point out. That's silly. How do you pay for this? You would pay for it in various ways, I think. It's not utopian. First of all, you'd have a healthier populace.
Yes.
Right?
We don't talk about this. Nobody hardly ever talks about it.
Yeah. Secondly, if I can use the traditional slogan, make the bosses pay for it. raise rates on the top 1 to 2%, cut military spending, and especially with regard to the more lethal weapons, nuclear weapons, and you're almost there with those 2 or 3 different things. This is not a utopian proposal that, in spite of what Chris Matthews says or what Hillary Clinton says, this is a very reasonable proposal. It'll cut down on. It'll actually cut down on bureaucracy. It'll make people like the government more. It'll if people have to pay taxes, at least they know they're getting something for their money, and it stands in direct connection to President Obama's plan. It's not a break with the past.
On it, making it better.
Exactly. And Bernie Sanders admits that. Hillary is trying to paint Bernie Sanders, how should I put it, as something he's not. Democratic Socialists have traditionally, in spite of their idealist commitments, they've traditionally concerned themselves with precisely being pragmatic, precisely being aware of the constraints they're working in. And for that, they were criticized traditionally by radicals of all types, anarchists, communists, ultra-left Democrats. These are the people who criticized them.
Wow. Now, Stephen was a student of Ernst Bloch in Germany. Stephen actually got a BA. His BA was in, what subject was the BA? Was it in politics at the City University of New York. Then he went out to California to UC Berkeley, where he studied for his master's and PhD. And in the meantime, he did some studies in Germany, Leipzig?
In Leipzig?
Leipzig University.
Well, no, actually, I was in Tübingen.
Okay. Talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Okay. Tübingen was a university where I was in 1973, and they had, on a Fulbright, and they had an unbelievable array of teachers. I mean, when I think back, Ernst Bloch was the most famous. Ernst Bloch was as famous in Europe as, I don't know, I don't want to say James Joyce is here, but somebody certainly on that level. And Bloch was the great philosopher of utopia, and he studied this concept for his entire life. And what he wanted to do was, in a nutshell, one, suggest that the identification of utopia with nowhere, as Samuel Butler put it, Irwan, nowhere backwards, was the name of his utopian country, or Thomas More.
Yes.
His idea was, you'll have to watch. Forgive.
Hello.
That's Phoebe.
Phoebe's with us.
Yes.
Here. At home with Stephen Eric Bronner.
Right.
Enjoying the cosmopolitan sensibility here.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, at any rate, so Bloch wanted to eradicate or challenge that view. He wanted to claim instead that utopia is a changeable force that has an impact on politics, and especially on the great mass movements. He always liked to say, if you think of liberation theology, if you think of fascism or you think of communism, all of these great movements, or Martin Luther King, have utopian components. And what it's up to us to do is to ask why. There's something else that's worth thinking about. If you think of all the great revolutions, the American Revolution included, all of them had a utopian element. in the sense that it was something ultra-democratic, ultra-left. Now, admittedly, these moments were extinguished, and these uprisings fell apart. But the question remains, why is it that in all these great mass movements, the utopian element comes to bear? It must speak to something inside of people, as Bloch would say. And what it speaks to is a desire for the best life. And for Bloch, one of the issues for utopia was to define what does the best life look like, which, by the way, is not an easy task. If I ask my class, what is the best life, or what is your utopian vision, I'm liable to get 75 different answers, and what all of them would have in common is not that they're too utopian, it's that they're too bound to the present. It's interesting, because our imagination is limited by the experiences in society that we have. Bloch wanted to expand the imagination, and so expand our experiences. And he basically believed that the first thing, as I said, was to try to figure out what the best life was, and to overcome, how should we say, misinterpretations or the inability of people with conflicting views and conflicting interests to begin to be able to understand one another in terms of striving for that goal. That's basically it. And Bloch made a lot of mistakes. He was one of the two figures that Thomas Mann used in The Magic Mountain for his character Naphtha. The other was George Lukács, with whom Bloch was
Until they
not just friends. I mean, best friends.
Best friends. Oh,
and until they broke. But it's sort of odd that Bloch also was a communist, and he actually wrote a defense of Stalin's purge trials. He just swallowed it, and he admitted it.
He wasn't perfect.
He wasn't perfect, and he always admitted as much with regard to that.
Wow. Well, I want to show another book here. This is another. These books are by my bedside, by the way. These are books that I read and go back to, and that nourish me and keep my hope strong. Another one is One-Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse, which is a book that made Marcuse an international intellectual celebrity back in the 1960s. This guy was like a rock star. He would show up on campus, and there would be hundreds, thousands of students would be out there to greet him. And in this book, which I only read last year, despite the fact that I've known about Marcuse for a while because he was friendly with Stanley Aronowitz, who's a mutual friend of ours, Stephen, right? He was like a mentor to Mr. Aronowitz. And Stanley, when he was a guest on our show, he talked also about the good life, that we need to have a vision of what a good life is. According to Marcuse, he thinks that we could be working 3 hours a day. And this is by his analysis and by a lot of economists. Back in the 1960s, there was a Senate subcommittee, United States Senate subcommittee, that found, this was 1965, they said by the year 2000 we would have a 15-hour work week. So in a sense, there is a lot of excess work, what Marcuse calls surplus repression, that keeps the population submerged, and we could be living a happier life, a more joyful life, you know. I want to just mention about Hillary Clinton. something which I haven't heard mentioned too much, what I think it should be brought out by Bernie Sanders is that Bill Clinton, he passed the NAFTA treaty, which caused a lot of outsourcing of labor, which was a terrible trade deal. He was against it when he was running. Then when he became president, he voted for it. Now Hillary is saying she's against the TPP. If she could get in and flip-flop on that, we're all in big trouble, because that is a coup d'etat for the corporate state, so to speak, right? The other thing about Bill Clinton, he passed this telecommunication bill, which has consolidated the media. One reason you're not getting this kind of discourse of someone like a Stephen Bronner on MSNBC is because of that, is because we have a very constricted media that's keeping these ideas submerged. What I think is hopeful, what I'm very inspired by the Bernie candidacy, it seems to be that there is this revolutionary movement afoot, and if we can build on that and grow that, and whether or not Bernie wins or not, I hope he does win, there is something in the land which is very hopeful and positive, which was, we had it with Occupy Wall Street, which was brutally suppressed by the corporate state. And so am I being too pie in the sky to think that there is something really amazing that's happening in our country now, and that we can build on that?
Well, it's sort of, there's sort of an odd, again, an odd thing. If you want to think of democratic socialism, you could certainly find inspiration for that in FDR's New Deal. All the great programs that are talked about today are somehow anticipated by Roosevelt's expansion of the government into the free market. Same thing with Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society. Johnson would have been an incredible president if it hadn't been for Vietnam. And, of course, President Obama. The Affordable Health Care Act was the greatest single government program undertaken certainly since the Great Society, and perhaps even since the New Deal. Now, what's interesting is the criticisms, or the utopian criticisms, are always the same. As soon as one tries to bring out a radical new policy, or that's of an egalitarian sort, deregulation, that's never considered utopian. It's only regulation that's utopian. It's interesting. Policies that aid the poor and working people, shortening the work week, raising minimum wage, furthering workmen's compensation, all of these, Social Security, all of this stuff was at one time or another considered utopian. On the other hand, lowering taxes on the wealthy, that's not considered utopian. Allowing no tax on capital, you mentioned outsourcing before, on capital that flows abroad, that's okay. And that's not utopian. Now, it seems fairly clear, whenever tax breaks are given to large corporations, the assumption is that they're going to reinvest their profits in the United States. But in fact, they don't do that. They invest abroad, where labor is cheapest. And yet, that is not that desire to have that investment happen here simply through the market. That's not utopian, even though it's blatantly mistaken. In any event, if we think of FDR instead of in the usual national terms, that, the New Deal is something unique to America, you find during that period the exactly the same types of programs being fostered in France, the same sort of general outlook being fostered in among the Italian exile community, the German exile community. That is to say that the left has to stand together for a radical economic program that defends against incursions against democracy and fascism and irrationalism. Now, I'm sure to many, including yourself, this sounds familiar. This is what we're searching for today, and that's what Bernie incarnates. It's the attack. I mean, if you think of the right in the United States, and we just emphasize Trump, that's, in my view, this is completely the wrong way to think about it. You have three major candidates: Trump, Cruz, Rubio, and then we could throw in Carson, perhaps. You put their numbers together, you're talking about 2/3 of the Republican Party. And they're not very different, I don't think. And it's interesting that the mainstream, the establishment Republicans are now trying to sell Marco Rubio as a moderate, which shows how far right this segment of the country really is. Bernie's concern is that of, and I guess to a certain degree Hillary Clinton, you want to defend the great achievements of the social movements of the past: voting rights, same-sex marriage, in general, gay rights, the desires for people, for a multicultural universe and a multicultural society that will manifest itself in education. So that's the political element. On the other element, it's a defense of like President Obama too. It's a defense of science. Think of cultural warming. It's a defense of general cultural standards and a certain style of discourse, which shouldn't be underrated. To my mind, and perhaps this is too crude, but I think we give much too much credit, and the mainstream media gives much too much credit to the intellectual elements going around on the right. Most of these guys, and this is what I think from watching the debates and so on of the Republicans, they're just thugs. There's no, there's no content to any of this. People say whatever they want. They may not know the difference between Iraq and Afghanistan. And somehow, when that gets translated into the popular discourse, somehow this becomes a position which, even if it's wrong, we have to take seriously. I don't even think it needs to be taken seriously in intellectual terms. In political terms, it's a tremendous danger. And as much of a danger as, in my view, the reactionary economic policies, the hatred of immigrants, this xenophobia and anti-intellectualism and anti-science, and this general kind of provincialism. This is serious stuff, and this involves shoving the country to the right. I don't think there's any question about it. This isn't Hitler in Weimar. It's not the Ku Klux Klan and Reconstruction, but it's bad. It's really bad. And I've never heard such, in all the time I've been interested in politics, the kind of disrespectful attitudes towards a president as President Obama is getting. And to think that this isn't in part because he's black and represents a black constituency. I mean, you want to talk about utopian in the worst sense. That would seriously be it.
Well, I just want to say that sort of ties into your last book, which was a critique of racism. And I think if somehow Bernie Sanders could unite with the Black Lives Matter people, they say one of his weaknesses is that even if he wins Iowa and New Hampshire, that he doesn't have a solid basis with the black community. What do you think of that argument?
Well, I think that can change, and I think it will change. In my last book called The Bigot, one of the things I argued was that the old-fashioned kind of bigot, sort of the Bull Connor type, the George Wallace type, people of that sort, these loud Southern rednecks, Archie Bunker. This, I'm not saying that it's gone, but I am saying that there's a new kind of bigotry. And that bigotry is in a certain way much more pernicious. It's not simply institutional racism. It's being willing to argue positions that disadvantage blacks, women, and gays, immigrants, while at the same time saying, I'm not a racist or a sexist or a xenophobe. No, I want to cut the welfare state because I want to, how should we say, heighten individual responsibility. I want to cut voting rights because I want to argue against fraud, even though the possibility of fraud is Lori Minetti, who is really an expert on this, put it to me. The chances of serious fraud are less than being hit by lightning,
Right.
And yet it's fraud. Why do we push an evangelical agenda? Well, it's not really because we're dogmatists or true believers or prejudiced against Islam and the like. The argument would be, this is our Christian tradition. This is who we are, as Samuel Huntington once said. And so you have this weird situation in which the same groups, again, immigrants, women, people of color, gays, are being targeted by policies that are justified on non-racial, non-sexist, non-provincial grounds. And that's the danger. You got to look at the policies, not simply at the words.
This is really scary now to me in terms of Trump. The thing, it started out as a kind of entertaining thing, and I'll be the first one to admit I'm guilty. You watch him and it's fun, you laugh. Because I think a lot of people thought it was going to fade out. It hasn't faded out, and it's grown stronger. And I think it represents a kind of a nadir, a low point of anti-intellectualism in the country that could be very scary. Now, you say it's not fascism in the sense of Adolf Hitler, but there is a fascistic quality to Trump, and it comes across in his anger. It comes across in his denunciation of anybody who disagrees with him. It comes across in his making fun of people who are crippled, putting down women, putting down minorities. And if it looks like a duck and it sounds like a duck, folks, it's a duck. It's a duck. Now, I think it's another example too of lack of education. He brags about the fact that he went to the Wharton Business School. Well, what do you learn when you go to business school? You learn that profit is all about making money and screw the other guy, make as much money as you can. And that's what's, I think, completely out of whack in our education system in our country. The lack of humanistic ideas, the lack of knowledge of critical theory and critical thinking and people. So I think maybe this is a wake-up call for America to say, we can't let Trump become president. We don't want that finger on the nuclear button. That would be frightening. You know, how could you go to bed at night with this guy in the White House? So, I think we'll come to our senses, and eventually that won't happen. Hopefully Bernie will get in. But what does this mean in terms of a wake-up call educationally, and including our media? Claudia and I, my wife and I, we have this television show on education, art, and social change. Claudia works a full-time job. We're trying to do what we can. I teach. But we wish that we had a show like this that would go out to a bigger audience, and we wish people like you would get on MSNBC. So, you know, Rachel Maddow, you know, but how can we, you know, see this as a wake-up call to action? And also, I'm tired of arguing about politics. Some people on the right, you can't even, it's hard to even have a rational conversation.
Exactly.
So, anyway.
Well, I mean, there's certain things that I think are necessary. If you think of utopia in the worst sense, it's the person who stands outside the political system and says, well, I'm not going to compromise my principles by voting for any of these guys. And let's be clear, even Bernie has his limits. I mean, he's made mistakes on gun control and on a number of other issues which you could look at. Hillary Clinton, of course, there was that disaster with her own attempt at health care, and her support for the Iraqi war, and a number, I think, of misguided foreign policy decisions, and a timidity on domestic stuff. All of that's true. All of that's true. But the reality for political people is to recognize every election is about the lesser of the two evils. That's just to let utopia sort of intervene with that would be a real disaster. And that kind of sectarianism, interestingly enough, was one of the reasons Hitler got into power in the first place. It wasn't the compromises of the socialists, quite the opposite. It was that nobody was willing to compromise with them as Weimar became more imperiled. And so I think what the first step is, we have to recognize there's no standing outside this choice, whether it's Bernie or it's Hillary. And I think the argument that Bernie can't win against Trump, but Hillary can, I don't think that's true. And I think it's a very disingenuous position to take. First of all, the polls are much closer than people say. Secondly, 10% of the voting population is going to make the difference, no matter who runs. And if I can put it this way, Bernie running for that 10% of independent, indecisive voters, I don't see necessarily that Hillary is a better bet than Bernie is. I mean, why would that be? Especially if they recognize the disaster that the Republicans are going to put forward. So.
You know, I also like to remind people, I think it's important to reflect on the climate crisis, right? That sort of, in a way, like this brings this whole thing, it really is a kind of do or die thing now. This didn't even exist during Roosevelt's time, you know, that we have a climate crisis. It was on the front page of the Times like a week ago that 2015 was the hottest year on record by a mile. Right, so that's not even debatable. Although the Republicans deny it, they continue to deny. They're like an anti-science party, and which is very strange. But also the loss of democracy. The loss of democracy. There was a Princeton University study last year that said that America is no longer a functioning democracy. That the will of the ordinary citizens does not matter compared to the will and the opinions of the 1% of the 1%, that they control the whole process now. So if we're not even living in a democracy, then it's like, how do we get our democracy back? Hillary Clinton, well, she just wants to sort of go along with the flow, where it seems like a Bernie is more likely to get our democracy back. What do you think?
I mean, if we weren't in a democracy, Bernie wouldn't have a chance to begin with.
Okay, so
right? Yeah. It's all how you run it. Okay. Princeton or Harvard or any other university. One can't be. One shouldn't, I think, be seduced by the names. But what's true is that there are different tensions working, or there are different competing interests working in this capitalist system. It's not that we are simply without guilt with regard to the kind of people who wind up in office. It's not just the top 1%, my view. The Tea Party is not composed primarily of the super rich, although they do get money from the Koch brothers and so on. But the question is, how do they wind up in the position where they can demand even more money? And that's through hard work and through political action and ideological action. And we have, I think, many of us on the left have simply been too lax and unwilling to take up the challenge the way it should be taken up.
Wow. Does the left need a new political formation, or does the left need a media, maybe a newspaper or something like that? Do you think, what would be the antidote? And would Bernie Sanders be considered a part of the left also? Would he be, or, Yeah.
This is let me take your third question first. This thing with, is Bernie a leftist? Is he really a socialist? Yeah, right. Or is Obama really progressive or a socialist? This is a ridiculous discussion. The way one talks about socialism is in its historical context, just like anything else. If Bernie or Obama are not within the tradition, social democratic or democratic socialist tradition, well, who is? I mean, who would you look to? There's certainly no less progressive, and probably more progressive than the socialists, self-styled socialists, organized socialists in France or in Germany. Certainly in Germany.
Denmark and Norway.
Yeah, I mean. Yeah, I mean, this is a question that has to be dealt with in the context. It's easy to stand on the left and and embrace the worst temptations of utopia if you don't have any power and you're not responsible for anything. The reality is, this is a capitalist democracy. I don't need Princeton to tell me that. But what that means is, whoever gets into power, whether it's Bernie or it's Hillary or I don't know, you can pick somebody further left, they're going to have to make compromises with capital, because that's what the system is. It's a capitalist democracy. And the question is, to what degree are the compromises acceptable, and to what degree aren't they? And that's the kind of realism I think we have to learn. And of course, to keep us in line, we need those regulative ideals of utopia and the best life, and that'll help us make the judgments.
There was an article just published in Nation magazine. I forget the writer, but she said that she just got back from Norway, spent 5 years living in Norway, and that the culture shock of coming back to the United States was like just so intense that she felt the sense of competition, the lack of time, the kind of meanness that was existed here, that in Norway it was like just not there. It was like you had more time to be with friends. There was a sense of caring between people, a greater sense of community. So is it like possible that America now needs to learn from Europe, that we need to go to Europe and see what's happening in France and in Denmark? It was really an article that I read about that Bernie wrote 3 years ago called What the U.S. Can Learn from Denmark, that I used in my teaching when I was teaching at Essex County College at the time. My students couldn't believe that there is such a country that has universal health care, that has a guaranteed income for everybody, you know, that has where the happiness of the people is considered over. Yeah, so you have high taxes, big deal. You know, we have a happier country, healthier country, that's what's more important. And so is it possible that we should be turning to these European countries for guidance?
Let me make it an even more radical claim. I think that is what, consciously or unconsciously, the left has been doing. You pick a major piece of welfare legislation, and in the United States, it's always 50 years late. You think of, for example, rudimentary workers' compensation, rudimentary Social Security, rudimentary control over nationalization of the railroads. These were all issues that came up in Europe in the 19th century. They were demands that were formulated. In fact, it's even worse. The right to work was a slogan that was developed by Louis Blanc during the revolutions of 1848. It was from the left. That is to say, cure unemployment. The United States, what is the right to work? The right to work is the right to ban unions. You know, 26 states, by the way, still have that. And the vision, I mean, this is the realistic, if I can put it this way. Cornel West likes to speak about a prophetic pragmatism, and it's not a bad description. What frames our realism as leftists, I believe, is the socialist tradition, the tradition of the labor movement. The great labor movements. This does not mean what the media usually has it mean. That is to say, white, ethnic, male patriarchs, who are that's the working class. That's not the working class. I think we have to begin to think of this in new ways. If you think of the women's movement, or you think of the movement of peoples of color, immigrants, the majority of those people are working people. You know? And if we're going to talk about a labor movement without speaking about equality for those groups is a contradiction in terms, and it's a denial of the traditions associated with democratic socialism and social democracy. It would seem to me that the vision of the 1930s now, which calls for a defense and expansion of liberal Republican norms in the political sphere, an expansion of the welfare state, and a shortening of the work week, and the like, in the economic sphere, and a defense of rationalism, science, civility in discourse, cosmopolitanism. These are the values we have to push in the cultural sphere.
And you are the person who coined the phrase cosmopolitan sensibility, which means to be at home in the world, anywhere in the world. And Claudia and I are very at home today in Fort Lee, New Jersey, in your lovely apartment. You and Annie have made us feel so at home here. Even before we started filming, we were sitting on the couch. Claudia, just pan around a little bit this wonderful apartment here and enjoying coffee and cookies and a nice dialogue dialogue and a sense of community, and that's kind of the things we like to promote on our show as well. And, Claudia and I are both Christians, and we come out of that prophetic Christian tradition as well, that the Pope has been celebrating in his trenchant critiques of capitalism. It would seem to me that a Bernie Sanders victory would be very in line with what Pope Francis has been preaching now. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly, progressive, whatever critique of religion one wants to put forward, it doesn't mean that there aren't progressive elements within each religion. In fact, Ernst Bloch wrote a book called Atheism in Christianity, which was an inspiration for the Richard theology. Yeah, and those are brave and wonderful people. You think of the Maryknoll nuns, and in Latin America, Archbishop Romero. These are quite extraordinary characters, and it's. I mean, I have to say, in my own work on human rights, the people I work with the most closely are religious people. I'm the pagan.
You're the pagan.
I'm the pagan. Also, with regard to Bernie Sanders, there's that ethnic component.
Jewish, Brooklyn.
And I want to know why Hillary would be the breakthrough as president as a woman, but Bernie is not the breakthrough as a Jew.
Wow.
I think that's worth thinking about,
Yeah.
And especially since I think Bernie is probably more progressive. I'm not saying he has all the answers, but he's probably more progressive on Palestine and Israel than Hillary is.
Wow. And I want to remind people that Hillary Clinton's first political job was campaigning for Barry Goldwater in 1964, who was like the Donald Trump of his time, right? So far to the right that he was off the charts, and I think he won like one state or two states.
We're allowed to learn.
Right. I wanted to say something about Erich Fromm for a second, because we're talking about religion, and I bought a book a couple of weeks ago called Psychoanalysis and Religion by Erich Fromm, where he talks about the humanistic religion versus the patriarchal religion quality of that the early humanistic quality of religion has a lot to do with making better people, kinder, more caring people, which psychoanalysis is also about empowerment and freedom and those kind of things. And Erich Fromm, who wrote a book called The Sane Society in 1955, which I read last year, and I was teaching in Bariqua College, which is a college for poor Latino kids up in Washington Heights, and I was talking about Erich Fromm in class. It wasn't on the curriculum, but I brought in Fromm because as a professor, I like to share with my students what comes alive for me. And I was reading Fromm, and this young Latino man, got so inspired, he ran out and he got a copy from the library, and he told me it was the best book he ever read. So these ideas are also percolating. And you said that you're about to be in a conference on Erich Fromm. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Yeah.
Well, there's a conference that's taking place at CUNY, the City University of New York. I think it's on April 1st. And a number of young, not me, but a number of young Fromm scholars are putting that together. Lawrence Friedman, Neil McLaughlin, these are really excellent people. With regard to what you were saying about Fromm, I couldn't agree more. Fromm was the great critic of Herbert Marcuse, and he was in the Frankfurt School. That's how he started. And very close friends with its director, Max Horkheimer. Erich Fromm, was probably the only member of the Frankfurt School who, when it came to religion, really knew what he was talking about. He, as a child, as a young person, studied with the two major rabbis in Europe, and Germany in particular. And with his wife, he put together what came to be known as the Therapeutikum. It was therapy rather, and putting Torah in there is sort of cute. That's what it was called as a joke in Berlin. Fromm's attempt at developing a merger between social radicalism and religion, I think, becomes evident in also as an influence for Latin American liberation theology. You know, he started the Psychoanalytic Association of Latin America.
Didn't he give free psychoanalysis?
And he gave free psychoanalysis. He was a very, very progressive person, very practically engaged, and the most popular writer among all the Frankfurt School, more than Marcuse.
Wow.
Yeah.
He was also on Mike Wallace, had him on a guest on his talk show back in the 50s, which you can Google. If you Google Eric Fromm, Mike Wallace, you'll find a YouTube of that. And I thought that was hopeful that back in the 50s, I think television was more substantive in some way to get a thinker like Fromm. And in terms of free psychoanalysis, I would say the entire Republican candidates should all, immediately go to psychoanalysis. That couldn't hurt. As we wrap up here today, Stephen, I want to give you the last word and just final thoughts on our discussion, final thoughts to the country. We've got about 2 minutes. What do you think in terms of Bernie, in terms of the future, in terms of hopes and utopia?
I think that in the first instance, support for Bernie Sanders is essential. As you put it correctly, even if he doesn't win, a more radical, not the ultimate radical, but a more radical vision of socialist possibilities is being made palpable by Bernie. We're not, in short, this is the willingness to endorse something new in the political realm, and it's a defense of the achievements of the social movements and of an expansion of the welfare state and the kind of values that we all share in an increasingly polarized and ugly climate, with the kind of challenges that reactionary challenges, counter-revolutionary challenges that we face. Bernie is a breath of fresh air, and this is a wind of hope. Hope is a very important thing. It shouldn't be made fun of. And embrace the hope.
Okay. Thank you so much, Stephen, for this wonderful, nourishing, stimulating dialogue. And the conversation will go on.
I hope so. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you.